The development of racial equality in the United States. Although the rights of African Americans was guaranteed by law in the 1960s, African Americans did not receive equality. The extent of racial equality is seen in the civil rights history, recent events, and collected data. Martin Luther King Jr. was the face of the civil rights movement. He used the method of nonviolent protest to bring about change in the U.S. Martin 2011. Martin Luther King's tactics angered many white Southerners. He and other civil rights and church leaders got the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act passed. Martin Luther King attracted the support of hundreds of thousands of black and whites, Hanks 2009. After he died, the civil rights movement slowed, and no new legislation was passed. Malcolm X was also a civil rights leader. He did not use the same tactics as Martin Luther King. He wanted a separate black nation that could operate without the approval of white society. This was called black nationalism. Malcolm X attracted many youth in various organizations. Tizoko and Torre 2010. This movement was much more violent and very impatient. The violent tendencies and radical desires alienated more of the civil rights supporters and sympathizers. The civil rights movement fell apart when both MLK and Malcolm X were assassinated. This chart displays the answers to questions whose answers vary by race. African Americans feel that they are being treated less fairly than whites. Both blacks and whites believe that the U.S. discriminates against African Americans in all settings. In the work office, an African American woman with lighter skin would get paid more than, get a promotion faster than, and marry a man of higher economic status than an African American woman with darker skin. Brown 2009. A study referenced by Brown states that 38% of men preferred women with a lighter skin tone. Brown also discusses how African American women conform to a European beauty standard and not their own. 84% of blacks feel that they are treated less fairly than whites. There has been an increase in police brutality. Many young black men have been beaten, shot, and killed, even when they are unarmed and innocent. Because of the increase of police brutality, the movement Black Lives Matter was created. This new movement is the new branch of the civil rights movement. Pew Research Center 2016. Based on this chart alone, African Americans face constant judgment on everything they do. There is evidence of racism in an African American's everyday life, yet there is a debate over whether racism is real and in the U.S. It is obvious that the answers from the Caucasian pool would be different from the answers given by the African Americans. But why are these answers so drastically different? 38% of whites believe America has done its job and gotten rid of racism, while only 8% of African Americans believe the same thing. Pew Research Center 2016. Many whites believe racism doesn't affect their lives and doesn't affect the lives of African Americans. These two charts support the existence of racism in the U.S. 70% of African Americans believe that racial discrimination keeps them from advancing in society. Pew Research Center 2016. African Americans know that there is racism in the U.S. and that they have to face it every day, while white Americans disregard this idea altogether. The data and historical examination clearly shows that there is racism in the U.S. and that it is being watched. The U.S. has taken some steps forward since the civil rights movement of the 60s. The development of social equality can be tracked through civil rights history, current events, and conducted studies. Racism can be seen through these polls that were taken in 2016, and in our everyday life, walking down the street, you can see that racism is there. And we need to keep track of it in order to prevent it. And I've gathered my resources from a various number of sources.